You cannot even afford a car. My brother laughed, spitting a mouthful of expensive scotch onto the pristine grass of our parents' estate. At that exact moment, the deafening roar of military-grade rotor blades tore through the sky overhead. A sleek black helicopter descended rapidly, landing dead center on the manicured lawn and destroying his beloved landscaping. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer and smiled as the security detail stepped out. "My ride is here," I said. My mother fainted on the spot, hitting the driveway with a loud thud. If you have ever been treated like a peasant by the very people who share your blood, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button, because you will want to see exactly how I legally evicted my entire toxic family and took everything they owned in one single afternoon. The journey to that spectacular confrontation began an hour earlier in the back of a standard ride-share vehicle. I sat quietly as my driver navigated through the sprawling, affluent neighborhoods of Prince George County in Maryland. The sprawling brick mansions and iron gates belong to some of the most successful African American families in the state. My parents, Calvin and Yvonne, fit right into this world of country club memberships and excessive pride. They worshipped wealth and social status above all else. I wore a simple, unbranded beige trench coat over a plain white blouse and dark trousers. It was a deliberate choice. My family always judged me by my labels, and I found it highly entertaining to let them underestimate me. They truly believed I was still the struggling administrative assistant working a dead-end job in the city. They had absolutely no idea that I actually owned a venture capital firm on Wall Street managing billions in assets. Keeping my wealth a secret was the only way to protect my sanity from their endless greed. The car pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of my parents' estate. The gates swung open, revealing the massive circular driveway filled with luxury vehicles. I stepped out of the basic sedan and immediately felt the hostile energy radiating from the front porch. My older brother DeAndre stood there leaning against the massive stone pillars. At 34, he still acted like the star college football player he used to be. I wore a ridiculously expensive silk shirt unbuttoned to show off a gold chain. Beside him stood his wife, Brittany. She came from old money in Nantucket and never let any of us forget it. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, and she rested one hand on her pregnant belly with a practiced performative grace. They were both holding crystal flutes of champagne, watching me with matching expressions of sheer disdain. Before I even reached the bottom of the wide brick steps, DeAndre started his verbal assault. Still riding with strangers, Jasmine, he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet neighborhood. "I thought your little accounting job would at least pay you enough to buy a used Honda by now. It is genuinely embarrassing having that beat-up sedan drop you off in front of our house. The neighbors are probably watching and wondering who hired the new maid." I kept my face perfectly neutral as I walked up the stairs. "It is just a car, DeAndre," I replied calmly. "It gets me from point A to point B without a monthly payment that I cannot afford." I knew that comment would strike a nerve. DeAndre ran a cryptocurrency company that was supposedly highly successful, but I knew his entire lifestyle was a fragile house of cards built on debt and deceit. His jaw tightened, but before he could formulate a response, his wife stepped forward to deliver her own flavor of insult. Brittany smiled at me with an expression so dripping with fake pity it made my skin crawl. "Come on now, DeAndre, be nice to your sister," she said, placing a condescending hand on my shoulder. "We know you are just an administrative assistant, sweetie. It is not your fault you lack the entrepreneurial mindset that DeAndre and my family share. Everyone has their limits." She turned gracefully and picked up a bottle from the patio table. "Here," she said, shoving a cheap commercial bottle of wine into my hands. "I bought this at the grocery store just for you. We know you are not used to the good stuff, so we saved the real vintage crystal for the adults. Do not worry about spilling anything either. If you want, I have some old clothes from our last ski trip to Aspen that I was going to throw away. I can bag them up for you before you take your little taxi back to your apartment." The sheer audacity of her microaggressions would have broken me 5 years ago. Now it just fueled the fire of my impending retaliation. "Thank you, Brittany," I said, forcing a polite smile as I gripped the cheap glass bottle. "You are always so endlessly thoughtful about other people." She beamed, missing the sarcasm completely, and took DeAndre by the arm, leading the way into the grand foyer. I stepped over the threshold into the house I grew up in. The scent of roasted garlic and expensive heavy perfumes filled the air. The massive crystal chandelier cast a harsh light over the polished marble floors. I could hear my parents laughing in the formal dining room, completely unbothered by my arrival. I walked down the long corridor, preparing myself for the usual interrogations about my weight, my hair, and my imaginary lack of ambition. But the moment I crossed into the dining room, the laughter abruptly stopped. My parents were sitting at the heads of the long mahogany table. There were no plates of food waiting for me. There was no warm family greeting. Instead, sitting perfectly centered on my empty porcelain dinner plate, was a thick stack of legal documents with a yellow sticky note pointing to a signature line. The trap had been set, and they were waiting for me to step right into it. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, staring at the stark white paper, before forcing myself to breathe deeply and face the greedy smiles of the people watching me closely. "You cannot even afford a car," my brother laughed, spitting a mouthful of expensive scotch onto the pristine grass of our parents' estate. At that exact moment, the deafening roar of military-grade rotor blades tore through the sky overhead. A sleek black helicopter descended rapidly, landing dead center on the manicured lawn and destroying his beloved landscaping. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer and smiled as the security detail stepped out. "My ride is here," I said. My mother fainted on the spot, hitting the driveway with a loud thud. If you have ever been treated like a peasant by the very people who share your blood, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button, because you will want to see exactly how I legally evicted my entire toxic family and took everything they owned in one single afternoon. The journey to that spectacular confrontation began an hour earlier in the back of a standard ride-share vehicle. I sat quietly as my driver navigated through the sprawling, affluent neighborhoods of Prince George's County in Maryland. The sprawling brick mansions and iron gates belonged to some of the most successful African American families in the state. My parents, Calvin and Yvonne, fit right into this world of country club memberships and excessive pride. They worshipped wealth and social status above all else. I wore a simple, unbranded beige trench coat over a plain white blouse and dark trousers. It was a deliberate choice. My family always judged me by my labels, and I found it highly entertaining to let them underestimate me. They truly believed I was still the struggling administrative assistant working a dead-end job in the city. They had absolutely no idea that I actually owned a venture capital firm on Wall Street managing billions in assets. Keeping my wealth a secret was the only way to protect my sanity from their endless greed. The car pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of my parents' estate. The gates swung open, revealing the massive circular driveway filled with luxury vehicles. I stepped out of the basic sedan and immediately felt the hostile energy radiating from the front porch. My older brother DeAndre stood there leaning against the massive stone pillars. At 34, he still acted like the star college football player he used to be. He wore a ridiculously expensive silk shirt unbuttoned to show off a gold chain. Beside him stood his wife, Brittany. She came from old money in Nantucket and never let any of us forget it. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, and she rested one hand on her pregnant belly with a practiced performative grace. They were both holding crystal flutes of champagne, watching me with matching expressions of sheer disdain. Before I even reached the bottom of the wide brick steps, DeAndre started his verbal assault. Still riding with strangers, Jasmine, he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet neighborhood. "I thought your little accounting job would at least pay you enough to buy a used Honda by now. It is genuinely embarrassing having that beat-up sedan drop you off in front of our house. The neighbors are probably watching and wondering who hired the new maid." I kept my face perfectly neutral as I walked up the stairs. "It is just a car, DeAndre," I replied calmly. "It gets me from point A to point B without a monthly payment that I cannot afford." I knew that comment would strike a nerve. DeAndre, a cryptocurrency company that was supposedly highly successful, but I knew his entire lifestyle was a fragile house of cards built on debt and deceit. His jaw tightened, but before he could formulate a response, his wife stepped forward to deliver her own flavor of insult. Brittany smiled at me with an expression so dripping with fake pity it made my skin crawl. "Come on now, DeAndre, be nice to your sister." she said, placing a condescending hand on my shoulder. We know you are just an administrative assistant, sweetie. It is not your fault you lack the entrepreneurial mindset that DeAndre and my family share. Everyone has their limits. She turned gracefully and picked up a bottle from the patio table. Here, she said, shoving a cheap commercial bottle of wine into my hands. I bought this at the grocery store just for you. We know you are not used to the good stuff, so we saved the real vintage crystal for the adults. Do not worry about spilling anything either. If you want, I have some old clothes from our last ski trip to Aspen that I was going to throw away. I can bag them up for you before you take your little taxi back to your apartment. The sheer audacity of her microaggressions would have broken me 5 years ago. Now it just fueled the fire of my impending retaliation. Thank you, Brittany, I said, forcing a polite smile as I gripped the cheap glass bottle. You are always so endlessly thoughtful about other people. She beamed, missing the sarcasm completely, and took DeAndre by the arm, leading the way into the grand foyer. I stepped over the threshold into the house I grew up in. The scent of roasted garlic and expensive heavy perfumes filled the air. The massive crystal chandelier cast a harsh light over the polished marble floors. I could hear my parents laughing in the formal dining room, completely unbothered by my arrival. I walked down the long corridor, preparing myself for the usual interrogations about my weight, my hair, and my imaginary lack of ambition. But the moment I crossed into the dining room, the laughter abruptly stopped. My parents were sitting at the heads of the long mahogany table. There were no plates of food waiting for me. There was no warm family greeting. Instead, sitting perfectly centered on my empty porcelain dinner plate was a thick stack of legal documents with a yellow sticky note pointing to a signature line. The trap had been set, and they were waiting for me to step right into it. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, staring at the stark white paper, before forcing myself to breathe deeply and face the greedy smiles of the people watching me closely. I stared at the thick stack of legal documents resting on my dinner plate. My father tapped his heavy gold watch, urging me to sign away my grandmother's trust fund. I picked up the expensive fountain pen lying next to my glass. I did not click the button to reveal the ink. Instead, I flipped it upside down and drove the sharp metal casing straight through the center of the contract. The pen pierced through the thick paper and lodged deep into the expensive mahogany dining table with a loud crack. My mother gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if I had just stabbed her directly. My father slammed his fists onto the wood, demanding to know what was wrong with me. I left the pen standing upright in the ruined contract and looked directly into my mother's eyes. You love bringing up that stolen car, I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. You love telling everyone how my brother sacrificed his reputation to save me from a teenage mistake. Let us get the story straight for once. Deshaun was the one driving that night. He was completely intoxicated and slammed his car into a storefront. You forced me to climb into the driver's seat before the police arrived. You told me I had to take the fall because Deshaun was about to sign a massive college football scholarship and a DUI would ruin his life. I was terrified and underage, so I did exactly what you commanded. I walked away with a criminal record that followed me for years. I lost my own academic scholarships because of that record. I spent 5 years working 3 different minimum wage jobs just to afford night classes at a community college, while Deshaun partied on a university campus, completely funded by his athletic free ride. Do not ever pretend he saved me. I took the bullet for his reckless behavior, and you both gladly handed me the gun. The silence in the dining room was thick and suffocating. My mother opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. She knew every single word I said was the absolute truth. Deshaun could not handle the sudden exposure of his greatest shameful secret. He violently kicked his heavy wooden chair backward. The chair crashed onto the marble floor, echoing loudly through the massive room. He stormed around the table until he was standing directly next to my seat. He leaned over me, planting both of his massive hands on the table, trapping me in my chair. He tried to use his sheer physical size to intimidate me, just like he did when we were kids. I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath as he glared down at me. His face was flushed red with anger and embarrassment. You think you are so smart, Jasmine, he growled, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You think bringing up ancient history changes anything about today. I am the only real entrepreneur in this family. I am building a legacy while you push papers across a desk for someone else. My cryptocurrency exchange is on the verge of going public. I am creating generational wealth, and you are going to sit there and try to ruin it because you are still bitter about a high school mistake. You owe me this money. You owe this family your loyalty. Sign the new contract right now and transfer those funds to my holding account before I lose my patience completely. I did not flinch or lean back away from him. I held his angry gaze with complete indifference. I had faced down ruthless Wall Street executives who could destroy entire companies with a single phone call. A failing former football player with anger management issues was not going to make me break a sweat. His attempts at physical intimidation were entirely useless, and he could see it in my eyes. He stepped back, running a hand over his face in frustration. That was when his wife decided it was her turn to defend her husband's shattered ego. Brittany walked gracefully to his side, placing a supportive hand on his arm. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked down her nose at me. Her posture was the perfect picture of wealthy Northeastern arrogance. "You know, Jasmine," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "it is incredibly sad to watch you act like this. You are clearly just jealous of everything Deshaun has achieved. You have spent your whole life being average, and now you cannot stand to see your brother succeed on such a massive scale. You are sitting here making up ridiculous stories about car accidents to avoid supporting his vision. It is completely pathetic. My family up in Nantucket actually understands how business works. We understand what it takes to build a modern empire. That is exactly why my father personally invested $2.5 million into Deshaun's company last month. We recognize a brilliant financial mind when we see one. He is about to finalize a massive expansion deal that will double our investment by the end of the quarter. You are just a bitter woman, holding on to a tiny trust fund because it is the only valuable thing you have ever had." She smiled a triumphant little smile, believing she had just delivered the ultimate crushing blow. She thought her family's $2.5 million investment was an impenetrable shield that proved my brother's superiority. She had absolutely no idea that she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their entire fantasy world. I let her words hang in the air, allowing the dead silence to amplify her smug confidence. She truly believed her wealthy background made her untouchable in this dining room. My parents nodded along with her, eager to align themselves with her generational wealth while ignoring the truth about the past. They were so desperate to maintain their social status, they gladly let this woman insult their own daughter. Deshaun smirked, his earlier panic completely erased by his wife's aggressive financial posturing. He adjusted his silk collar and took another sip of his drink, waiting for me to run out in shame. Instead, I slowly reached into my designer handbag, feeling the thick edges of the heavily redacted financial dossiers I had printed out earlier that morning. It was finally time to show them all what real power looked like. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled the incredibly thick stack of printed papers from the main compartment, dropping them onto the polished surface of the table. The heavy slapping sound echoed loudly through the otherwise silent dining room, cutting sharply through the intense and suffocating tension that hung in the air. I let out a very low, steady laugh, making Brittany quickly take a step back. "You find this funny?" she asked, her voice trembling with outrage. I casually picked up my heavy silver dinner fork and calmly sliced a tender piece of roasted chicken directly in front of me on the porcelain plate. I deliberately took a very slow bite, chewing the meal thoroughly, while they all continued to stare at me in absolute open-mouthed shock. I swallowed the food and purposefully took a very slow, refreshing sip of ice water from my crystal glass before finally looking directly into her absolutely furious eyes. "I find it hilarious, Brittany," I said conversationally. "I find it incredibly amusing that your family built generational wealth in Nantucket, but never bothered to teach you how to read a basic Securities and Exchange Commission filing." Brittany crossed her arms, her manicure digging into her silk sleeves. "What exactly are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice pitching higher as she glanced nervously at my brother. DeAndre stared at the documents, his confident smirk melting into pure terror. I slid the first folder across the wood, pushing it until it rested against Brittany's plate. Your father invested $2.5 million into my brother's supposedly revolutionary cryptocurrency exchange, I said smoothly. Did he ask to see the physical server farms or the digital asset ledgers before transferring the funds? Of course he did not, I continued. He saw a charismatic former football player with a fast-talking pitch, and he blindly handed over the cash. If he had done his due diligence, he would have discovered. DeAndre does not own a single piece of proprietary technology. His entire exchange is a white-label shell company renting cheap servers from a failing tech firm. My mother let out a sharp gasp. He does not hold any actual liquidity, Brittany, I explained, watching the color drain from her face. Every luxury car he drives and vacation he posts online is entirely funded by dangerous debt. I took your father's money and used it to pay off interest on previous loans. He is running a Ponzi scheme and your family became his biggest victim. That is a complete lie, DeAndre shouted. Do not listen to her, Brittany. She is just trying to tear us apart. I flipped open the second folder, revealing bank statements, highlighting offshore transfers. If I am lying, then explain the $6 million you owe to a predatory lending syndicate operating out of Miami, I said. Explain why you missed your last 3 minimum interest payments, leaving your accounts in total default. Explain why their collection agents have been calling this house, leaving threatening voicemails that you keep deleting before mom and dad hear them. My father, Calvin, stared blankly at my brother, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that paralyzed him completely. $6 million, my father whispered, barely audible. DeAndre, tell me she is lying. Lying, tell me you do not owe $6 million. My brother could not form a single word. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead. Brittany snatched the folder from the table and began flipping through the pages, her eyes darting across the highlighted bank transfers. No, no, she muttered, shaking her head. No, my father had his financial advisors look at the portfolio. The portfolio was forged, I said simply. I know this because my firm was hired to audit the same lending syndicate you are indebted to. We flagged your account weeks ago. You are absolutely broke, DeAndre. You are far worse than just being financially broke. You have dragged this entire family into a financial death spiral just so you could pretend you were a self-made billionaire on the internet. Brittany dropped the thick stack of printed papers as if they had suddenly caught fire in her hands. She backed away from the table, covering her mouth. You told me the business was generating record profits, she cried. You swore to us that the expansion deal was already finalized. DeAndre took a step toward her, holding his hands up. Baby, please let me explain, he begged, his voice trembling. It is just a temporary cash flow problem. I have a new investor lined up who is going to cover everything. We simply need to secure this trust fund today to bridge the gap until the new capital clears. I promise you that I can fix all of this. He is never going to fix this, I told her. The syndicate is calling in the full principal amount by Friday. If he does not produce $6 million, they will start seizing assets. That means they are going to come after your family money next, Brittany. They are going to drag your parents' reputation through federal court when the fraud investigation goes public. You are going to be tied to a criminal enterprise because you wanted to marry a man who looked good in a suit. The mask of the successful entrepreneur rapidly melted away, leaving behind nothing but a terrified and desperate man who had finally run out of options. His fear transformed instantly into a blinding, violent rage. He let out a furious scream and lunged across the wide mahogany table. He knocked over a heavy silver candelabra, sending glass and hot wax flying across the room. He reached for my phone and the folders, grasping wildly to destroy the evidence of his profound failure. Before his fingers could even graze the documents, my father threw himself forward. My father grabbed DeAndre and shoved him backward with surprising force. DeAndre stumbled, catching his balance. My father stood between us, his chest heaving as he stared at his golden child. My father's face had turned a sickly pale gray, completely devoid of its usual color. The horrifying truth had finally penetrated his ego, and the sudden realization of their complete financial ruin hung heavily in the suffocating air as he slowly stood, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming terror of his own impending permanent downfall. My father did not turn his anger toward his golden child. Instead, he slowly turned to face me. His breathing was shallow and ragged as he looked down at the ruined contract pinned to the table. He reached out and violently yanked the pen out of the wood, tossing it aside. He smoothed out the punctured paper, pressing his hands flat against the mahogany surface. "Jasmine, you have to sign this," he pleaded, his voice devoid of its usual booming authority. "You need to authorize the transfer right this second before the banks close. We can figure out the syndicate problem later, but we absolutely must secure this specific capital today." I looked at him in genuine disgust. "Why are you begging me to sign a release form for an account you already know is empty?" I asked him. "You just heard me expose his entire fraudulent empire. That trust fund only holds $300,000. It will not make a single dent in a $6 million debt owed to a Miami crime syndicate." My father shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with a manic desperation. "You do not understand what is at stake here, Jasmine," he cried, leaning heavily over the table. "This is about our entire survival." I narrowed my eyes, studying his terrified expression. "What exactly did you do?" I demanded. My mother let out a loud wail, burying her face in her hands. My father swallowed hard, unable to maintain eye contact. He looked down at the expensive marble floor as he finally confessed his ultimate betrayal. "I already used your trust fund," he whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "You did what I asked," keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "I used it as collateral," he admitted, his voice cracking. 6 months ago, when Deshaun told us he was having cash flow issues, we wanted to help him secure a bridge loan. The banks would not approve a commercial loan without substantial liquid assets backing it up. We had all our money tied up in the house and the country club memberships. So I forged your signature on a power of attorney document. I pledged the entire balance of your grandmother's trust fund as a guarantee for a second mortgage on this estate. I leveraged everything we owned to get Deshaun $2 million in emergency funding. I stared at the man who had spent my entire life calling me a failure. "You committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to bail out your son," I stated flatly. "You stole the only inheritance my grandmother left me and betted on a Ponzi scheme." My father looked up, his face twisted in defensive agony. "We were going to put it back," he yelled. "Deshaun promised the expansion deal would close in 30 days, and we would replenish the account before you noticed it was missing. But the interest rates on the second mortgage were predatory. We could not keep up with the payments, and the bank realized the collateral documentation was irregular. They froze the remaining equity and called in the entire debt. We need you to sign this new document today to retroactively authorize the pledge, so I do not go to federal prison for forgery." He had literally stolen my identity and mortgaged his own home to feed my brother's delusions of grandeur. Before I could respond to my father's criminal admission, my mother suddenly threw herself onto the floor. Vivian dropped to her knees right beside my chair, her expensive silk dress pooling around her on the marble. She grabbed my hand with bruising force, her long manicured nails digging into my skin. She was crying tears of pure selfish panic. "Jasmine, you have to save us," she sobbed loudly, pulling my hand toward her chest. "The bank is foreclosing on this house tomorrow morning. They sent the final notice of eviction 3 days ago. If we do not produce a massive cash payment by 9 o'clock tomorrow, they will lock us out and auction off the property. You have to go to your bank right now and take out a personal loan to cover the gap. You have good credit and no mortgage draining your finances. You can easily secure a few $100,000 to keep the bank away while we figure out how to handle the syndicate." I forcefully ripped my hand out of her grip, disgusted by her physical touch. "You want me to take out a personal loan to pay for your fraudulent mortgage?" I asked, staring down at her pathetic display. "You want me to go into lifelong debt to save the house you gladly risked to coddle your favorite son?" My mother glared up at me, her sorrow instantly vanishing, replacing it with toxic maternal manipulation. "You owe us your life," she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We raised you. We allowed you to live under our roof even when you embarrassed us with your lack of ambition. We are your family, and you are obligated to protect us. If you walk out that door and let us lose this house, you are dead to me forever. You will have absolutely nobody left in this world." I watched my mother panting on the floor, her face stained with ruined makeup and misplaced righteous anger. My father stood frozen like a defeated old man. Deshaun was trembling in the corner, completely useless and stripped of his massive ego. Brittany was staring at the front door, clearly calculating how quickly she could escape back to Nantucket before federal investigators arrived. They were all completely pathetic, relying on manipulation and theft to sustain a lifestyle they could not actually afford. I calmly reached out and picked up the cheap grocery store wine glass that Brittany had forced upon me earlier. I took a very slow, methodical sip, letting the bitter liquid coat my throat. I set the glass down silently on the table and picked up a crisp, white linen napkin to gently dab the corners of my mouth. I folded the napkin perfectly into a square and placed it next to my plate. "You do not need to threaten me with abandonment, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "You do not need to worry about the bank foreclosing on this property tomorrow morning either. I know about the eviction notice. In fact, I knew about the foreclosure proceedings 3 months ago." The room fell into a dead silence. My mother stared at me, her lips trembling as she processed my words. DeAndre was cowering near the candelabra, trying to comprehend how his quiet little sister knew about a confidential bank foreclosure. Brittany was the first one to break the silence. She let out a sharp, nervous laugh. "You are insane," she said. "There is no physical way a secretary would know about private mortgage defaults." She looked at my parents, rolling her eyes. "She is probably making things up to sound important because she is embarrassed about being poor." I ignored Brittany's pathetic attempt to maintain superiority. Instead, I reached down into the large beige designer handbag sitting near my feet. My mother had spent the evening assuming it was a cheap knockoff without noticing the immaculate stitching. I pulled out a glossy magazine and placed it face down on the table next to my napkin. "You have spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence," I said, looking directly at my father. "You assumed I was a failure because I refused to participate in your endless superficial competitions. I chose to let you believe that carefully crafted illusion." My father frowned, stepping closer. "What are you talking about, Jasmine?" he demanded, his voice shaking with confusion. I placed my hand flat against the glossy back cover of the magazine. "If I had told you the truth 5 years ago, you would have treated my bank accounts like your own personal slush fund," I explained calmly. "You would have manipulated me into buying luxury cars and paying for expensive country club memberships so you could brag to your neighbors. I hid my life from you to protect the empire I was building." DeAndre scoffed, wiping the sweat from his forehead. An empire, he mocked, attempting to regain a fraction of his lost pride. "You answer phones for a living. You are a nobody trying to sound tough because you hacked into my emails." I slid the magazine across the polished mahogany surface. It glided smoothly, stopping right in front of my father's hands. "I suggest you turn that over," I told him, maintaining direct eye contact. My father hesitated, his fingers hovering over the glossy paper. He slowly flipped the magazine over, revealing the front cover. It was the latest Forbes 40 Under 40 issue. Taking up the entire front cover was a professional photograph of me wearing a sharp-tailored suit, standing in front of the New York Stock Exchange. The silence that followed was absolute. My father stopped breathing entirely. He picked up the magazine, bringing it closer to his face, as if his eyes were deceiving him. My mother scrambled off the floor, abandoning her dramatic tears to look over his shoulder. DeAndre pushed himself away from the wall, staring at the cover in utter disbelief. Brittany dropped her hands to her sides, her arrogant posture completely collapsing as she read the bold headline printed directly beneath my name. "Founder and managing partner of Obsidian Capital, the relentless visionary redefining private equity on Wall Street." My mother gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. "You," she whispered, her voice cracking. You are a managing partner at an investment firm. I am the sole owner of a venture capital firm managing over $4 billion in global assets." I corrected her, watching the realization crush her. "While you praised DeAndre for pretending to be an entrepreneur, I was doing the work. I built Obsidian Capital from nothing. I did not take a single penny from your pockets, and I never relied on an arrogant father-in-law to fund my business ventures." I looked pointedly at Brittany, who immediately looked away, her face burning with profound humiliation. My father traced his trembling fingers over the cover. "Obsidian Capital," he muttered, staring blankly. "I know that name. My golf partner mentioned that firm last week as the most aggressive private equity group." He looked up, his expression shifting from terror to a sickening glimmer of hope. "Jasmine," he said, his voice dripping with desperate warmth, "you are a billionaire. My own daughter is a Wall Street billionaire." He stepped toward me, holding the magazine like a winning lottery ticket. "Do you understand what this means, Vivian?" he said, turning to my mother. "We are saved. Our daughter can pay off the syndicate debt right now. She can clear the mortgage." Watching them pivot from calling me worthless to treating me like their savior was physically repulsive. They did not care that I had achieved something monumental. They only cared that my bank account could rescue them from their fraudulent actions. My mother reached out toward me. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant girl," she cried, her voice thick with fake maternal affection. "I always knew you were destined for greatness. You have to help your brother Jasmine. You have to use your firm to bail him out. We are family. You can write a check right now and make all of this terrible stress go away forever." I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back from the table. I looked at the woman who had threatened to disown me minutes earlier. "I am not writing a check to save DeAndre," I stated firmly, watching her fake smile instantly shatter. "I am not using my firm to pay off a Miami crime syndicate. He can face the consequences of running a Ponzi scheme." My father slammed his hand against the magazine, his temporary hope vanishing. "You have to help us," he yelled, his face turning purple. "If you do not care about him, you have to care about us. The bank is foreclosing tomorrow morning. They are going to throw us out. You cannot let the bank take our home." I walked around the table, stopping just a few feet from my father. I looked at the panicked sweat dripping down his temples. "I did not let the bank take your home," I told him, my voice cold and definitive. I watched his face contort in confusion. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle over the room. "I did not just know about the bank foreclosing on this property," I explained, watching him freeze completely. "When Chase Bank realized your collateral documents were irregular, they immediately put the debt up for sale in a private auction. I bought your debt." The room remained entirely motionless for several seconds as the reality of my ownership settled over them. DeAndre was the first to break the paralyzing silence. He stumbled backward away from the table, his chest heaving as if he could not draw enough oxygen into his lungs. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly dropped the device onto the marble floor. "You are a psychotic liar," he spat, jabbing his finger toward my face. "You do not own anything. You are just a bitter administrative assistant who forged some banking documents to scare us." He quickly dialed 911, pressing the phone tightly against his ear. "Yes, I need immediate police assistance at my residence," he said, his voice rising in an orchestrated panic. "We have a violent intruder in our home. She is a deranged, estranged relative who broke in and is currently threatening my pregnant wife and my elderly parents. Please send officers right away before she hurts someone." He disconnected the call and glared at me with a pathetic, triumphant smirk, believing he had just regained control of the narrative. I did not move a single inch from where I stood. I simply reached forward and collected my glossy magazine, placing it carefully back into my beige designer handbag. "You just made the biggest mistake of your entire miserable life, DeAndre," I told him calmly. "Calling the authorities to a house you no longer own, while sitting on a mountain of fraudulent debt, is a remarkably stupid tactical decision." My mother collapsed into her dining chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. My father paced back and forth near the windows, peering through the expensive silk curtains into the dark neighborhood street. Brittany immediately recognized her cue to play the ultimate victim. She strategically positioned herself behind DeAndre, holding her pregnant belly and practicing her distressed breathing. She was preparing to leverage every ounce of her old money privilege the moment law enforcement walked through the front door. Because we were located in one of the most affluent gated communities in Prince George County, the police response time was less than 4 minutes. I saw the red and blue emergency lights flashing through the front windows, casting harsh colored shadows across the crystal chandelier and the ruined dining room table. Heavy footsteps echoed rapidly up the front porch steps, followed by a loud, authoritative pounding on the mahogany front door. DeAndre rushed to the foyer, ripping the door open with an expression of manufactured terror. 2 police officers stepped inside the grand entryway. The lead officer was a tall, heavily built man whose hand hovered cautiously near his utility belt. The second officer remained a step behind, scanning the massive house, assessing the situation. "Officers, thank God you are here," DeAndre said, his voice shaking with fake relief. He pointed directly at me where I stood calmly beside the dining table. "That woman is my sister, but she has been estranged from our family for years, due to severe mental illness. She somehow bypassed our security gates and forced her way into our private family dinner. She is waving around forged banking documents and threatening to harm us if we do not give her money." Brittany did not miss a single beat. She let out a perfectly timed sob and buried her face into DeAndre's shoulder. Her shoulders shook as she produced genuine tears, crying hysterically. "Officers, she is completely unhinged." Brittany wept, wiping her eyes with trembling fingers. "She hates me because I come from a wealthy family in Nantucket, and she has always been obsessed with stealing my husband's money. She came in here screaming about destroying our lives and trying to extort us. I am pregnant, and I am so terrified she might physically attack me. Please, you have to get her out of our house before she does something terrible." My parents remained completely silent, allowing DeAndre and Brittany to construct this elaborate lie. They were willing to watch me get arrested just to protect their own fragile reputations. The lead officer took one look at the crying, wealthy pregnant woman and the protective, successful-looking husband in his expensive silk shirt. He then looked at me standing alone in my simple, unbranded beige trench coat. His internal bias made the decision for him instantly. He marched into the dining room, closing the distance between us with aggressive, intimidating strides. He completely ignored the ruined contract on the table and the fact that I was showing zero signs of erratic behavior. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands where I can see them right now," the officer commanded in a harsh, booming voice. He unclipped the restraint strap on his handcuffs, ready to forcefully detain me. "You are trespassing on private property, and you need to step away from this family immediately. Do not make any sudden movements, or I will place you under arrest for home invasion and attempted extortion. Hand over your identification and turn around to face the wall." DeAndre smirked openly, his confidence fully restored now that he had an armed officer acting as his personal enforcer. Brittany peeked over his shoulder, her fake tears instantly drying up as she waited to watch me get dragged out of the house in handcuffs. They truly believed their manufactured affluent image would always protect them from the consequences of their actions. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands in surrender, and I certainly did not turn around to face the wall. I maintained my perfectly composed posture and looked the aggressive officer directly in the eyes. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer, making sure all my movements were deliberate and completely non-threatening. The officer tensed his hand, gripping the metal handcuffs tighter. I pulled out my sleek matte black identification card and extended it toward him, holding it steady between my fingers. "I am not a violent intruder, and I am certainly not trying to extort anyone in this room," I said, my voice projecting absolute icy authority. "My name is Jasmine, and I am the founder and managing partner of Obsidian Capital on Wall Street. I am also the sole legal owner of this entire estate. The people crying behind you are the ones currently committing criminal trespass. I suggest you take this identification card, walk back out to your squad car, and run the property registry for this specific address through your federal database terminal. When you pull up the updated deed, you will see my name listed as the primary title holder. Once you verify that fact, I expect you to come back inside and escort these squatters off my property." The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting between the solid black identification card in my hand and the sobbing pregnant woman standing in the foyer. The sheer confidence in my voice directly contradicted the hysterical narrative my brother had just violently presented to him. He slowly reached out and took the card from my fingers, his aggressive demeanor faltering ever so slightly under my unwavering gaze. DeAndre let out a loud, dramatic scoff, stepping forward again. "Officer, do not listen to a single word she says," he demanded, waving his hands in the air. "She is a compulsive liar. She printed those fake documents at her cheap administrative job. She does not own a venture capital firm, and she definitely does not own this house. My family has lived here for 20 years. Arrest her before she tries to pull another stunt. The officer looked at my brother and then looked back down at the heavy premium material of my identification card. The card felt expensive and substantial in his grip. I did not break eye contact with the law enforcement official. I am giving you a direct lawful instruction, I told the officer, my tone dropping to a level of professional command that left no room for debate. You have a pregnant woman claiming she is in danger, and a man claiming I am an extortionist. The fastest way to resolve this dispute and secure this scene is to verify the legal property records. It will take you exactly 3 minutes to pull up the county tax assessments and the deed transfer history on your computer. If my brother is telling the truth, you can arrest me right now. But when you discover that I am telling the truth, I expect you to uphold the law and remove every single person who does not have my explicit permission to remain on my premises. The officer nodded slowly, his hand finally moving away from his handcuffs as he turned toward the front door to verify my absolute ownership. The front door clicked shut, leaving a vacuum of silence in the grand foyer. The second police officer remained standing near the entryway, resting his hand on his utility belt, while his partner went outside to check the federal database. DeAndre paced frantically across the polished marble floor, his leather shoes squeaking with every turn. He kept looking at the remaining officer, offering desperate, unsolicited explanations. She is a complete fraud. He insisted, his voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of fear and forced arrogance. My parents have owned this property for 20 years, and there is no way an assistant could purchase a multi-million-dollar estate. The officer did not respond, maintaining a professional, neutral stance. My father, Calvin, stood frozen near the ruined dining table, taking shallow, terrified breaths. He knew exactly what the police database was going to reveal, because he was the one who had fraudulently signed away my trust fund to secure that mortgage. 3 agonizing minutes passed before the front door swung open again. The cold evening air rushed into the foyer, carrying the lead officer back inside. His aggressive, intimidating posture he had displayed earlier was completely gone. He walked straight past my brother and approached me with careful, measured steps. He stopped a respectful distance away, offering me my matte black identification card, as if it were a fragile piece of glass. I am incredibly sorry for the misunderstanding, Mom, he said, projecting absolute deference and respect. I ran the property registry through the county tax assessment database and cross-referenced the deed transfer history. Everything is exactly as you stated. You are the sole legal owner of this entire estate, and the title is held free and clear under your private equity firm. DeAndre stopped pacing, his face twisting into pure denial. No, he shouted, stepping toward the office. Your system must be experiencing a glitch. You need to call your supervisor right now and arrest this woman before she steals our family home. The lead officer placed his hand on his belt, turning to face my brother with an unforgiving glare. Sir, I suggest you lower your voice and step back, he commanded sharply. The county records are perfectly clear and updated as of yesterday. The previous mortgage went into total default, and the property was legally acquired by this lady standing right here. The officer then turned his attention to my father, Calvin, who was gripping the edge of the dining table. Sir, you are currently trespassing on private property, he informed my father, his tone leaving no room for debate. The legal owner has requested that you vacate the premises immediately. If you do not pack your belongings and leave, I will have no choice but to arrest all of you for criminal trespass. The absolute finality of the police officer's words echoed off the high ceilings, destroying the last fragments of my family's manufactured reality. My mother, Vivian, let out a guttural, horrifying scream. The complete loss of her precious social status and her beloved mansion shattered whatever fragile sanity she had left. Her eyes went wild as she locked her furious gaze onto me. You ungrateful monster! She shrieked, turning a violent shade of purple. I gave birth to you. I put a roof over your head when you were nothing but a worthless child. You owe me everything you have. She lunged forward, launching her body across the dining room with her hands outstretched, aiming directly for my face. I did not even flinch. Before she could cross the distance, the second police officer sprang into action. He intercepted her, grabbing both of her arms and spinning her around. He pinned her hands behind her back and shoved her forward until she was pressed against the dining room wall. "Mom, you need to calm down or you are going in handcuffs," the officer yelled, pressing his forearm against her back. "Assaulting a property owner in the presence of law enforcement will get you a jail sentence." Vivian thrashed against the wall, sobbing and screaming obscenities, but she was powerless against the strength of the officer. Calvin rushed forward, raising his hands in a desperate plea for mercy. "Please, officer, do not arrest my wife," he begged, trembling with ultimate defeat. "She is just overwhelmed by the shock of losing our home. We will pack our things right now." Brittany stood near the hallway, watching her mother-in-law get pinned against a wall by the police. She looked at my father, begging like a broken peasant, and then she looked at DeAndre. My brother was cowering near the candelabra, shrinking away from the confrontation, completely useless and stripped of his fake alpha male persona. The horrifying pieces of the puzzle rapidly connected in Brittany's mind. The delayed business expansion, the aggressive phone calls, and now the immediate eviction from the family estate by the sister they had relentlessly mocked. The truth hit her like a physical blow. "He really does not have any money," she whispered, terror widening her eyes. She stepped away from DeAndre, looking at him as if he were a disgusting insect. "You lied to me about absolutely everything," she said, panic consuming her. "Your business is a complete fraud. You have $6 million in criminal debt, and you stole $2.5 million from my parents. We do not even have a place to sleep tonight because your sister legally evicted us." DeAndre reached out his hand, tears welling in his eyes. "Baby, please do not do this right now," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "We can go stay at a hotel and figure out a plan. I promise I will fix everything." Brittany slapped his hand away with extreme force, her face twisting into pure hatred. "There is no fixing this, you absolute loser!" she screamed, her voice echoing violently through the grand foyer. "My parents are going to hire the best lawyers on the East Coast, and they are going to completely destroy you in federal court." Brittany did not wait for a single word of explanation. She grabbed her designer handbag from the entryway table and ran out the open front door, sprinting down the driveway and abandoning him entirely to his own pathetic misery. The sound of Brittany's heels clicking frantically down the driveway faded into the cold night air, leaving my family completely defenseless. The late police officer did not offer them a single moment of sympathy after watching her flee. He unclipped his radio calling dispatch to confirm the eviction was proceeding smoothly before turning his stern gaze back to my father. "You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever essential items you can carry in your hands," the officer commanded, his voice echoing off the marble floor. "There will be no moving trucks and no packing boxes tonight. You will take your immediate personal necessities and you will vacate this property immediately." My mother let out another agonizing wail, slipping down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her expensive silk dress wrinkling beneath her. Calvin stood frozen, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the officer. "10 minutes is impossible," my father pleaded, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "We have lived in this estate for 20 years. All of our assets, our clothes, our family heirlooms are upstairs in the master suite. You cannot expect us to leave our entire lives behind in 10 minutes." The officer crossed his arms, completely unmoved by the dramatic display. "Before you committed mortgage fraud and illegally trespassed on this lady's estate," he replied bluntly. The second officer walked into the kitchen and returned a moment later, tossing a roll of heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags onto the foyer floor. "Start packing," he ordered. My brother DeAndre stared at the black plastic garbage bags, as if they were physically insulting his very existence. The man who had spent the last 5 years wearing custom-tailored suits and driving leased luxury vehicles was now being told to pack his life into the same bags we used for yard waste. He slowly bent down, his hands trembling as he ripped a bag from the roll. My father rushed to my mother's side, hauling her off the floor and pulling her toward the grand staircase. They scrambled up the velvet-lined stairs, slipping and stumbling over each other in a pathetic rush against the clock. I remained standing near the dining room entrance, watching the people who had tormented me for decades reduce themselves to absolute panic. Heavy thuds and frantic shouting drifted down from the second floor as they frantically threw their designer clothes and expensive jewelry into the trash bags. DeAndre sprinted into the formal living room, attempting to grab his expensive electronics and watches, but the second officer immediately stepped in front of him. Personal clothing and essential medications only the officer warned, placing his hand firmly on his belt. Anything else stays with the property. DeAndre backed away, his face twisting in humiliated rage as he realized he was leaving with absolutely nothing of actual value. 10 minutes passed in an agonizing blur of chaos and sobbing until the lead officer yelled up the stairs that their time was completely up. My parents slowly descended the grand staircase, looking like entirely different people than the arrogant couple who had demanded I sign away my inheritance an hour earlier. My father dragged two bulging black garbage bags behind him, his expensive loafers slipping on the marble stairs. My mother clutched a single bag to her chest, her face streaked with ruined makeup, her elaborate hairstyle completely destroyed by her own frantic pulling. DeAndre followed closely behind them, carrying his bags over his broad shoulders. His head hung low in ultimate defeat. The lead officer pointed toward the open front door, gesturing for them to exit my house. Step outside and move directly toward the street, he commanded, walking behind them to ensure they did not try to linger or grab anything else on their way out. I followed the procession, stepping out onto the massive front porch and leaning casually against the stone pillar to watch their permanent departure. The cool night air was sharp and biting. The red and blue flashing lights from the police cruisers parked at the end of the driveway illuminated the expansive front lawn. Massive custom wooden doors across the street were opening, and affluent neighbors were stepping out onto their manicured lawns to see what kind of criminal activity had infiltrated their exclusive community. Luxury SUVs slowed down as they passed the estate, their windows rolling down so the drivers could get a better look at the spectacle. Calvin and Vivian, the couple who had spent 20 years boasting about their impeccable social standing and their phenomenal wealth, were now performing a public walk of shame down their own driveway. They were carrying black plastic trash bags under the watchful eyes of armed police officers, while their wealthy peers whispered and pointed from the sidewalks. My father kept his eyes glued to the pavement, his shoulders hunched so far forward he looked like a broken old man. The sheer social humiliation was destroying them faster than the actual loss of the real estate. They reached the middle of the sprawling front lawn, walking through the perfectly manicured grass that my father had always obsessed over. The crushing weight of the public embarrassment finally broke whatever remained of my brother's fragile ego. DeAndre stopped walking and dropped his black garbage bags onto the turf. He turned around to face the house, ignoring the police officers' warning to keep moving. He looked up at me, standing confidently on the elevated stone porch, holding my designer handbag, and watching his demise with absolute calm. His chest heaved as his mind desperately searched for a way to regain a single shred of superiority in front of the dozens of wealthy neighbors watching from the street. His face twisted into a mask of pure defensive hatred. He could not accept that the sister he had bullied for her entire life was now the legal owner of his sanctuary. He spat a mouthful of saliva directly onto the pristine grass right at the feet of the police officer. "You might have your name on the deed to this house, but you are still a lonely, pathetic loser," he screamed, his voice echoing aggressively across the quiet, wealthy cul-de-sac. "You do not have a husband, and you do not have a real family, because nobody could ever actually love you. You want to stand up there and act like you are a billionaire just because you bought some debt. But look at yourself, Jasmine. You took a cheap common ride-share Uber to get here tonight. You are wearing a basic boring coat, and you had to rely on a public driver just to attend a family dinner. You can stand on that porch and pretend you own the world, but the reality is you cannot even afford to buy your own car, let alone a cheap used one." He stood there panting with his fists clenched, waiting for me to react to his childish insults. He wanted me to cry or show any sign that his cruel words had penetrated my armor. I simply rested my hand on the stone railing of the porch and allowed my trench coat sleeve to slide back just an inch. The motion was casual, but the psychological result was utterly devastating. The warm yellow glow from the porch lights caught the polished rose gold housing and the intricate diamond bezel of my Patek Philippe watch. The immaculate timepiece was a custom order that cost more than $150,000. It was the kind of rare watch that only serious collectors and elite executives even knew existed. DeAndre had spent his adult life obsessing over luxury brands to overcompensate for his actual lack of wealth. His wide eyes immediately darted to my wrist. The aggressive sneer on his face vanished completely as his brain struggled to process the astronomical financial value of the object casually resting against my skin. He blinked rapidly, leaning forward slightly as if the dark was playing tricks on his vision. He recognized the unmistakable, flawless craftsmanship instantly. "That is an absolute fake," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger directly at my wrist. "You bought a cheap knockoff downtown to try and look important in front of the police. You do not make enough money to afford the sales tax on a watch like that." My father Calvin looked up from his cluster of black plastic garbage bags, his tired eyes following my brother's trembling finger. Calvin had spent decades rubbing elbows with wealthy clients at his country club and knew exactly what a genuine Patek Philippe looked like. He dropped his trash bag onto the wet grass, his jaw going completely slack. "It is real," my father whispered, his voice hollow and deeply defeated. "Look at the smooth sweep of the second hand and the reflection of the sapphire crystal. She is literally wearing a house on her wrist, DeAndre." My mother Vivian scrambled to her feet, clutching her ruined clothing. She looked frantically at the wealthy neighbors standing on their sidewalks recording our family drama on their smartphones. "Jasmine, please," she begged, her tone shifting instantly back to pathetic maternal manipulation. "Everyone in the neighborhood is watching us right now. You have proven your point, and you have humiliated us enough for one evening. Open the front door and let us go back inside before this becomes a scandal. We can sit down in the formal living room and negotiate a settlement like a proper family." I did not move a single muscle toward the locked front door. I looked down at my mother and shook my head slowly. "There is absolutely nothing left to negotiate, Vivian," I told her firmly. "You made your terrible choices when you forged my signature on federal documents, and now you get to live with the very public consequences." DeAndre could not accept the harsh finality of the situation. He viciously kicked one of the garbage bags, sending a pile of his expensive silk shirts and designer belts spilling out onto the damp grass. "You are still a joke," he yelled desperately, clinging to his last remaining insult. "You might have a fancy watch, but you still had to beg an Uber driver to bring you here today. You do not even have your own car to drive back to the city. You are going to stand on that porch and wait for another cheap taxi to pick you up while everyone on this street laughs at you." I looked at my watch again, noting the precise time before returning my cold gaze to my brother. "You measure wealth by the depreciating metal boxes sitting idle in a paved driveway," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the manicured lawn. "That narrow mindset is exactly why you are bankrupt and facing federal prison. A real billionaire measures their wealth by the absolute control of their own time." Traffic on the Interstate 95 corridor is consistently terrible on a Sunday evening. Sitting in gridlock, surrounded by angry, aggressive drivers, is a complete waste of my valuable resources. I prefer taking the express route when I travel. My brother let out a loud, bitter laugh, throwing his hands up into the cold night air. "The express route," he mocked loudly. "What are you going to do? Jasmine, call a premium ride share and pretend it is a luxury limousine? You are completely delusional." He opened his mouth to shout another pathetic insult, but the words never materialized. A strange low-frequency vibration began to ripple through the cold night air. It was not a recognizable sound at first, but a deep physical sensation that rattled violently inside our chests. My father stopped moving, his eyes darting anxiously around the dark street. The water in the decorative stone birdbath near the edge of the driveway began to tremble and splash rapidly over the sides. The low vibration quickly shifted into a heavy, rhythmic, mechanical thumping that echoed sharply off the surrounding brick mansions. The massive oak trees lining the wealthy cul-de-sac started to sway violently, their thick, ancient branches groaning loudly under an invisible crushing pressure. The wind abruptly intensified, whipping across the front lawn with an unnatural and terrifying force. My mother shrieked as the sudden gale destroyed her expensive hairstyle, blowing her hair wildly across her panicked face. The heavy black plastic garbage bags began to roll violently, spilling more of my family's carefully hoarded possessions across the yard. DeAndre stumbled backward, shielding his eyes with his forearms, as loose dirt and debris flew rapidly through the turbulent air. The rhythmic thumping grew louder, transforming into a deafening roar that swallowed the entire neighborhood. The affluent neighbors recording the eviction abruptly lowered their phones and looked up at the dark sky in breathless shock. A massive dark shadow blocked out the bright moonlight hovering dangerously close directly above our property line. The downward force of the rushing air flattened the pristine grass and snapped my father's prized rose bushes in half scattering red petals everywhere. My family cowered on the lawn, paralyzed by the deafening mechanical noise and the blinding spotlight that suddenly cut through the darkness, sweeping directly over their terrified faces. The dark shadow that had eclipsed the moonlight rapidly materialized into a massive matte black Sikorsky S-76 helicopter. The sheer size of the military-grade aircraft was utterly terrifying as it breached the towering tree line at the edge of the exclusive neighborhood. The deafening mechanical roar of the twin turboshaft engines drowned out every other sound in the cul-de-sac. It was a noise so physically overpowering that it vibrated deep inside our bones and rattled the thick glass windows of the surrounding mansions. The bright, blinding beam of the aviation spotlight swept across the immaculate properties, casting harsh, moving shadows that made the scene look like an active war zone. The velocity of the downward air currents generated by the massive rotating blades created an artificial hurricane. The wind violently whipped through the manicured trees, snapping thick branches and sending a barrage of leaves spiraling into the dark sky. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stone porch, letting the heavy gusts wash over me, while my trench coat billowed dramatically around my legs. I did not break my absolute composure as the monstrous aircraft descended directly toward the center of my newly acquired front lawn. Across the wide paved street, the affluent neighbors who had stepped outside to watch my family get evicted were now completely paralyzed by the spectacle unfolding above them. Wealthy doctors and corporate executives stood frozen on their pristine sidewalks, shielding their eyes from the flying debris. Within seconds, dozens of glowing smartphone screens pierced the darkness as every single neighbor began recording the unbelievable display of absolute financial dominance. DeAndre was caught entirely in the chaotic epicenter of the violent downdraft. The arrogant man who had just mocked me for taking a public rideshare was now physically cowering on the wet grass. The wind pressure forced him to his knees as he desperately tried to protect his face from the stinging barrage of flying dirt and snapped twigs. The black plastic garbage bags he had abandoned on the turf were violently ripped open by the sheer force of the artificial hurricane. His custom-tailored silk shirts and his carefully hoarded luxury shoes were violently sucked into the chaotic vortex of air. His entire wardrobe was scattered ruthlessly across the neighborhood, blowing into the street. His manufactured identity was being shredded and tossed into the wind, while high society watched through the lenses of their cameras. The massive black helicopter ceased its forward momentum and shifted into a stable hover just 15 feet above the sprawling front lawn. The relentless downward thrust of the rotor wash concentrated its destructive energy directly onto the crown jewel of my father's 20-year legacy. Calvin's prized decades-old rose bushes, the exact bushes he had spent thousands of dollars maintaining to impress his country club friends, were absolutely obliterated in seconds. The violent wind stripped the delicate red petals from their stems, creating a swirling crimson tornado that completely enveloped the front yard. The thorny branches were brutally snapped and flattened against the muddy earth, reducing years of meticulous landscaping into a shredded, unrecognizable pile of expensive mulch. Calvin watched the total destruction of his beloved status symbol from the edge of the driveway. He was physically weeping now, his hands clutching the sides of his head as the flying debris pelted his expensive suit. The perfect lawn he had obsessed over, the exact grass he had forbidden me from walking on, when I was a child, was being aggressively churned into a massive, chaotic mud pit by the hovering beast above it. His pristine suburban fantasy was being violently erased from existence. Vivian was still trapped on the edge of the driveway, her expensive silk dress completely soaked by the puddles and ruined by the flying mud. The relentless noise of the aircraft engines forced her to press her hands tightly against her ears, but it could not block out the overwhelming reality of her permanent defeat. She was completely pinned down by the hurricane-force winds, unable to stand up or retreat to the safety of the street. She was forced to watch from the ground as the ultimate symbol of extreme, untouchable wealth completely decimated the very property she had just been legally evicted from. The skilled pilot maneuvered the massive aircraft with flawless precision, lowering it steadily through the chaotic storm of flying dirt and shredded red rose petals. The landing gear made contact with the ruined earth, burying deep into the soft, muddy turf with a mechanical crunch. The immense weight of the Sikorsky helicopter crushed the remaining pristine grass, flattening the entire center of the yard under its massive matte black chassis. The pilot skillfully throttled back the twin engines, allowing the violent winds to slowly subside into a steady, aggressive hum. The spotlight clicked off, plunging the area back into the dim yellow glow of the streetlights. The mechanical whine of the decelerating rotor blades continued to echo off the brick facades of the surrounding mansions. The sudden relative quiet that followed the landing left the entire neighborhood in a state of ringing, breathless shock. Nobody moved or spoke as the thick dust slowly settled over the completely ruined landscape. Suddenly, the sleek side door of the matte black helicopter slid open with a sharp hydraulic hiss. The dark interior of the cabin was briefly illuminated, revealing genuine leather seating and polished wood paneling. Two heavily armed private security contractors stepped out of the aircraft, moving with precise military synchronization. They were intimidating men dressed in immaculate black tactical suits with discreet communication earpieces curled around their ears. They did not spare a glance at my brother kneeling in the mud or my parents weeping on the driveway. They operated with cold efficiency, focused entirely on securing the immediate perimeter around the aircraft. The first contractor stood at strict attention facing the street, with his hands clasped firmly, forming a physical human barrier between the helicopter and the stunned neighbors. The second contractor turned back toward the open cabin door and smoothly pulled out a small set of automated steps. He locked the steps into place against the muddy ground before turning to face the stone porch where I was standing. He stood perfectly straight, placed one arm behind his back, and extended his hand respectfully toward me, gesturing for me to board the aircraft. The private security contractor, standing by the automated deployment steps, kept his arm extended, waiting patiently with absolute military discipline through the violent, unpredictable gusts of wind. I stepped away from the elevated stone railing of the porch, letting my simple, unbranded beige trench coat flap wildly behind me in the artificial hurricane. My posture remained completely rigid and controlled, projecting an aura of absolute dominance as I prepared to leave my toxic family behind forever. I slowly descended the wide brick steps of the grand entryway, my designer heels clicking deliberately against the masonry, despite the chaotic, roaring environment. The hurricane-force winds generated by the massive Sikorsky rotor blades threatened to push me off balance, but I refused to show a single ounce of weakness or hesitation. I knew that dozens of affluent neighbors were standing on their pristine sidewalks across the street, holding up their glowing smartphones and recording every single second of this unbelievable spectacle. I walked directly into the churning storm of flying dirt and shredded red rose petals with my head held high. The heavy wet mud sucked aggressively at the soles of my shoes, but I did not alter my confident, measured stride. I moved with the absolute, unquestionable authority of a woman who had just purchased the very ground beneath her feet and was now surveying her newly conquered territory. As I navigated the ruined landscape of the front yard, I passed my father Calvin, who was still standing near the edge of the driveway. He looked absolutely destroyed, physically and emotionally. His expensive tailored suit was covered in damp earth and flying grass clippings, and his prized immaculate landscaping had been completely decimated in a matter of minutes. He reached out a trembling, desperate hand toward me as I walked past him, his mouth opening wide to shout something over the deafening mechanical roar of the twin turboshaft engines. Perhaps he was going to beg for my forgiveness, or maybe he was going to plead with me to pay off his fraudulent $6 million debt to the Miami crime syndicate. Perhaps he just wanted me to stop this massive public humiliation that was permanently destroying his precious social status in the affluent Maryland cul-de-sac. Whatever pathetic excuse or manipulation he was trying to offer, I did not even turn my head to acknowledge his miserable existence. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, completely ignoring the arrogant man who had literally stolen my inheritance and mortgaged my identity to save his golden child. Seeing that I was entirely unaffected by his presence, he let his hand drop limply to his side. His shoulders slumped forward in total absolute defeat as he finally realized that he possessed absolutely zero leverage over me anymore. His power was gone and his wealth was a complete illusion. I continued my deliberate path across the center of the yard, walking directly toward the massive matte black helicopter that sat waiting for my command. Right in the middle of my path, kneeling in the absolute worst of the aggressive churning mud pit, was my older brother DeAndre. The arrogant golden child who had spent his entire life taking credit for my sacrifices was now physically bowing before me in the dirt. His expensive custom-tailored silk shirt was plastered to his chest, soaking wet and entirely ruined by the damp grass and flying debris. The heavy black plastic garbage bags containing his only remaining worldly possessions were scattered uselessly around his knees, having been ripped open by the fierce downdraft. He slowly looked up at me as I stopped my progression right in front of him. The powerful downward thrust of the rotor wash forced him to squint his eyes against the stinging dirt, but I could clearly see the sheer terror and profound humiliation breaking his spirit. This was the exact same man who had viciously mocked my cheap clothes and laughed at my public rideshare just a few moments earlier. He had desperately tried to convince the entire neighborhood that I was a pathetic, lonely loser who could not even afford a basic used vehicle. Now he was staring up at a Wall Street billionaire CEO who commanded heavily armed private military contractors and legally owned the very earth he was currently kneeling on. The realization of his own pathetic insignificance was crushing him alive. The mechanical noise from the helicopter engines was overwhelmingly loud, making any kind of casual conversation completely impossible. I stepped slightly closer to him, looking down into his terrified, pathetic eyes with a gaze of pure, sub-zero ice. I did not have to scream like a maniac, but I projected my voice with enough sharp, cutting authority to slice directly through the deafening engine roar. "You were absolutely right about one thing, DeAndre," I yelled over the noise, making sure he heard every single syllable of his ultimate defeat. I watched his face contort in confused panic as he waited for my final judgment. He likely thought I was going to offer him a lifeline or show a momentary lapse of sisterly compassion. Instead, I leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer, maintaining my cold, unforgiving stare. "I really do not own a car," I told him, my voice dripping with absolute unshakable dominance. I raised my right hand and gestured toward the massive multi-million-dollar military-grade aircraft hovering violently in the background, waiting solely for my arrival. "My ride is here," I said. My mother Vivian had been watching the entire brutal interaction from her isolated position on the edge of the wet driveway. The absolute finality of my words, combined with the overwhelming, undeniable visual proof of my untouchable extreme wealth, finally broke her completely. The severe cognitive dissonance of realizing that the daughter she had systematically abused, neglected, and discarded was actually a terrifyingly powerful Wall Street titan snapped her fragile status-obsessed mind in half. She could no longer process the magnitude of her own colossal failure. Vivian's eyes literally rolled back into her head, showing only the stark whites of her eyes to the affluent neighbors, watching in stunned silence from the street. Her knees buckled instantly beneath her, ruining her silk dress as she collapsed backward in a dramatic dead faint. She hit the hard concrete of the driveway with a heavy, sickening thud, her body going completely limp against the cold pavement. Calvin scrambled desperately across the wet concrete, dropping to his knees to catch her unresponsive body, his face morphing into a tragic mask of utter ruined despair as my heavily armed private security team prepared for my imminent departure into the dark sky. The heavy thud of my mother hitting the concrete driveway barely registered over the rhythmic pounding of the helicopter blades. Calvin was kneeling beside her unconscious body, his expensive suit soaking up the dirty water from the pavement. He looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes, his mouth forming words I could not hear and did not care to decipher. He was likely begging me to call an ambulance or to stay and help revive the woman who had just commanded me to take out a personal loan to cover their criminal tracks. I stood at the base of the automated deployment steps and stared at them with complete emotional detachment. There was a time in my life when seeing my mother collapse would have sent me into a frantic panic. I would have dropped everything to ensure her safety, eager to prove my devotion to a family that constantly rejected me. Tonight, however, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. I turned my back on my parents without a single flinch. The heavy artificial hurricane whipped my trench coat around my legs as I placed my designer heel onto the first metal step of the aircraft. I ascended the short staircase with deliberate, measured movements. The primary security contractor stood perfectly still, holding his position to ensure my safe boarding, while the immense downward air pressure threatened to tear the neighborhood apart. I ducked my head slightly and stepped through the sliding side door into the spacious cabin of the Sikorsky helicopter. The contrast between the violent, muddy storm outside and the immaculate, pristine interior of the aircraft was staggering. The cabin smelled of rich, expensive leather and aviation fuel. The plush custom seats were arranged in a comfortable executive layout designed specifically for high-level corporate transit. I moved to the primary forward-facing seat and sat down, sinking into the soft upholstery. The second security contractor remained outside, standing at the base of the steps, watching the ruined front lawn with intense tactical focus. My brother DeAndre had been kneeling frozen in the mud since I delivered my final crushing statement. Watching me physically step into the multi-million-dollar helicopter finally snapped him out of his paralyzed state of shock. The terrifying reality of his situation crashed down upon him all at once. The Miami crime syndicate was going to seize his fake business tomorrow morning, and he was going to face federal prison time for wire fraud. His wealthy wife had abandoned him, and his parents were utterly bankrupt. I was his absolute last lifeline, and I was currently preparing to fly away into the dark sky. DeAndre let out a horrific guttural scream that tore from his throat. He scrambled forward, using his hands and knees to crawl through the thick, wet mud that had once been my father's prized, immaculate lawn. He completely abandoned whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. His expensive silk shirt was ripped and coated in dark brown slime as he desperately slipped and slid toward the aircraft. "Jasmine, please wait!" he screamed, his voice cracking with raw, pathetic terror. "You cannot leave us here like this. I am so sorry for everything I said. I will do whatever you want. I will work for you. Please just give me the money to pay off the syndicate before they kill me." He managed to stagger to his feet, slipping wildly in his ruined designer shoes as he tried to rush the helicopter. The two private military contractors reacted with terrifying synchronized speed. They did not draw their weapons, but their physical intervention was absolute and entirely unforgiving. The lead contractor stepped directly into DeAndre's path, planting his heavy tactical boots into the mud. DeAndre slammed into this contractor, but the security guard did not move a single inch. The guard simply raised his forearms and shoved my brother backward with a massive burst of kinetic force. DeAndre flew backward through the air, crashing violently onto his back in the center of the muddy yard. The second contractor immediately flanked his partner, forming an impenetrable human wall between my aircraft and my desperate brother. DeAndre tried to sit up, spitting mud from his mouth while heavy tears streamed down his dirt-streaked face. He reached his hands out toward the open cabin door, sobbing uncontrollably like a frightened child. I sat comfortably in my luxurious leather seat, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my older brother. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man who had gladly watched me take a criminal record for his drunk driving mistake a decade earlier. I slowly reached into my beige designer handbag resting on the seat beside me. My fingers brushed past the glossy financial magazine and found the thick folded pages of the original trust fund relinquishment contract. It was the exact same forged document my father had placed on my dinner plate to ambush me at the start of this miserable evening. I pulled the contract out of my bag and smoothed the heavy paper between my hands. I leaned forward slightly toward the open cabin door, making sure DeAndre was watching my every move. He stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, his desperate eyes tracking the white paper in my hands. He likely thought I was going to sign it right there and toss him a miraculous financial lifeline at the very last possible moment. Instead, I held the forged document out, past the threshold of the cabin door, directly into the violent, swirling vortex of the rotor wash. I opened my fingers and simply let go. The artificial hurricane instantly ripped the contract from my hand. The thick pages violently fluttered and separated, spinning rapidly through the air like erratic white birds. The aggressive downdraft slammed the papers directly down into the mud, right into DeAndre's weeping face. The physical evidence of their massive criminal forgery plastered itself against his wet cheeks before blowing away into the dark neighborhood street. The lead security contractor looked back at me for confirmation. I gave him a single sharp nod. He stepped up into the cabin and forcefully pulled the heavy sliding door shut. The thick, reinforced glass and heavy acoustic paneling instantly cut off the deafening roar of the engines and the pathetic screaming of my brother. The interior of the helicopter was suddenly enveloped in a tight, pressurized silence. I reached up and pulled a sleek black noise-canceling headset over my ears, adjusting the microphone comfortably near my mouth. The pilot engaged the primary throttle, sending a deep, powerful vibration through the floorboards. I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes as the massive aircraft smoothly disconnected from the ruined Earth and began its rapid vertical ascent into the cold night sky, leaving my entire toxic family drowning in the mud below. The smooth vertical ascent of the Sikorsky helicopter pressed my shoulders deeply into the custom leather seat I kept. My noise-canceling headset adjusted perfectly, blocking out the overwhelming mechanical roar of the twin turboshaft engines looking through the reinforced thick glass window of the cabin. I watched the sprawling brick mansion shrink rapidly beneath me. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the total devastation of the front lawn. I could clearly see the tiny figures of my parents being actively corralled by law enforcement officers. The police were physically directing Calvin and Vivian toward the dark street, forcing them to drag their pathetic black plastic garbage bags through the mud. They were being permanently exiled from the affluent neighborhood they had worshipped for 20 years. DeAndre was still kneeling in the ruined grass, a broken, insignificant speck totally consumed by the disaster he had created, the physical distance increasing. Between us perfectly mirrored the absolute emotional detachment I had finally achieved. The toxic anchors that had dragged me down for my entire life were finally severed. I was floating thousands of feet above their manufactured drama, completely untouchable and now entirely free. I turned away from the window and reached for the secure satellite telephone built directly into the polished wood console beside my seat. I dialed the direct emergency line for my lead corporate attorney at Obsidian Capital. The call connected instantly. Despite the late hour on a Sunday night, my team knew that when I called the private line, they needed to answer on the first ring. "David," I said, keeping my voice measured and authoritative over the secure connection, "I need you to immediately execute a total lockdown on the trust fund account, established by my late grandmother. My father Calvin recently forged my signature on a power of attorney document to pledge those exact funds as collateral for a predatory second mortgage. I want you to contact the federal banking authorities first thing tomorrow morning and report the fraudulent transfer, freeze every single liquid asset connected to his name, and ensure that he cannot withdraw a single cent to pay for his criminal defense. I want the bank to fully know they accepted forged documents so they can pursue their own separate federal charges against him." He thought he could use my identity as a shield, but he was severely mistaken. David quietly confirmed the instructions, rapidly typing the legal mandates into his system while I outlined the next phase of my retaliation. "We are not finished, David." I continued staring at the glowing altitude display on the cabin bulkhead. "My older brother DeAndre is currently operating a massive decentralized Ponzi scheme disguised as a cryptocurrency exchange. He is carrying over $6 million in toxic debt, owed to a dangerous Miami lending syndicate. He has completely falsified his liquidity reports, and he recently swindled $2.5 million from his wealthy father-in-law in Nantucket." I need you to draft a comprehensive anonymous whistleblower report tonight and submit it directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Include the specific offshore routing numbers we flagged during our independent audit of the Miami syndicate. Last month, the federal investigators need to raid his fake dealership and freeze his holding companies before he attempts to flee the jurisdiction. I want his entire fake empire dismantled and seized by the government by Wednesday afternoon. Make sure the SEC coordinates with the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding the wire fraud. DeAndre thought he could use my money to save his miserable life, but instead he is going to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. David promised to have the entire legal task force working through the night to execute my precise commands. I disconnected the secure line and placed the heavy satellite phone back into its designated charging cradle. The cabin of the helicopter was perfectly climate controlled, wrapping me in a comfortable cocoon of warm air as we cruised rapidly toward Manhattan. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the small refrigerated compartment near my feet. The cool liquid felt incredibly refreshing, soothing my throat after the intense shouting match on the front porch. I did not feel an ounce of guilt or hesitation regarding the severe legal actions I had just initiated against my own blood relatives. They had aggressively chosen their path when they decided to sacrifice my future to protect a violent drunk driver a decade ago. They had reinforced that terrible choice tonight when they ambushed me at the dinner table and demanded I cover their massive financial crimes. I was simply closing the loop and delivering the exact consequences. They had spent a lifetime earning the dark Maryland landscape, passed swiftly beneath the aircraft, replacing the sprawling suburban mansions with the bright glowing infrastructure of the interstate highways. I was returning to the financial capital of the world, where I wielded actual tangible power and ultimate control. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone, checking my morning schedule. The screen illuminated, revealing a sudden rapid influx of frantic text messages. I ignored the dozens of missed calls from random extended family members, who had likely just heard the shocking news of the eviction. One message notification caught my attention, appearing at the very top of my screen. It was a lengthy, desperate text from Brittany, my arrogant white sister-in-law who had fled down the driveway. Just a short time ago, the woman who had mocked my clothes and offered me her discarded ski gear was now begging for mercy. "Jasmine, please forgive me." She wrote her words bleeding with pathetic desperation. I had absolutely no idea. DeAndre was a criminal who stole from my parents. My family is going to cut me off completely for losing their investment money. I know you own a massive private equity firm now. I am terrified I have a baby on the way. Please, I am begging you for a job at your company. We'll do anything, even administrative work. I stared at the glowing text message for 3 seconds, allowing her profound humiliation to wash over me. I did not type a single word in response. I simply pressed the screen and deleted the message entirely, permanently, erasing her from my existence as the massive helicopter banked sharply toward the glittering New York City skyline. 2 days later, the chaotic, muddy disaster of the Maryland estate felt like a completely different universe from the sterile, immaculate environment of my Manhattan boardroom at Obsidian Capital. I sat at the head of a massive obsidian glass conference table overlooking the sprawling financial district through floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows. My posture was relaxed, but my focus was razor-sharp as I reviewed the final term sheet for a $600 million acquisition of a legacy healthcare technology firm. A dozen high-powered executives and corporate attorneys sat rigidly in their ergonomic chairs, hanging on to my every word. The negotiating team from the opposing side looked physically exhausted, having spent the last 14 hours trying to outmaneuver my aggressive buyout terms. They had severely underestimated me when they first walked into the room, assuming a 30-year-old black woman would eventually yield to their seasoned corporate pressure. I did not yield a single inch. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass, and systematically dismantled their final counteroffer by citing 3 obscure financial liabilities my team had uncovered deeply buried within their holding companies. I watched the opposing chief executive officer swallow hard as his entire leverage completely evaporated under my unrelenting scrutiny. He slowly picked up his platinum pen and signed the binding documents officially surrendering his company to my portfolio. My executive team remained perfectly composed, offering brief nods of satisfaction as we secured yet another monumental victory for our investors. The sheer magnitude of the capital, I was casually maneuvering across the table, perfectly highlighted the absolute absurdity of my family's arrogant delusions. They had treated me like an ignorant peasant worthy of wearing discarded ski clothes and drinking cheap grocery store wine. They honestly believed my entire existence amounted to fetching coffee for middle management while I was secretly conquering the most competitive and ruthless financial battleground in the world. The profound ignorance they displayed toward my actual capabilities only made this massive corporate acquisition taste that much sweeter. As the defeated executives packed their briefcases and filed out of the boardroom, my lead corporate attorney David remained seated to my right. He waited until the heavy soundproof glass doors clicked shut before sliding his encrypted digital tablet across the sleek table toward me. I looked down at the high-definition screen and saw a live news broadcast from a local Maryland television station. The breaking news, ticker scrolling across the bottom of the screen, confirmed that my carefully orchestrated retaliation had been executed with flawless precision. The footage showed dozens of heavily armed federal agents from the FBI and the SEC raiding the commercial lot of DeAndre's supposed luxury car dealership. The massive neon sign bearing my brother's name was already being dismantled by a heavy work crew. My anonymous whistleblower report regarding the Miami lending syndicate and the offshore routing numbers had triggered an immediate and catastrophic government response. David tapped the screen, bringing up a secondary report detailing the complete seizure of my brother's assets. The federal authorities arrived at his dealership just minutes before the violent collection agents from the Miami syndicate showed up to break his legs. David explained, his voice carrying a quiet professional satisfaction. The government immediately seized all of his commercial records and froze his entire network of fraudulent shell companies. Those luxury vehicles he loved showing off on social media did not actually belong to him at all. The original leasing companies are currently towing every single car off the lot while the feds dig through his fake ledgers. DeAndre is completely ruined, Jasmine. He has zero liquidity, zero assets, and he is currently facing dozens of federal wire fraud charges. I watched the silent aerial drone footage of tow trucks hauling away my brother's manufactured identity. He had built his entire pathetic ego on the foundation of rented wealth and stolen familial funds. He had relentlessly mocked my basic rideshare vehicle while secretly drowning in a terrifying ocean of toxic criminal debt. Now his fake empire was a pile of ashes blowing across a federal evidence table. I did not feel a single drop of pity for the man being loaded into the back of a federal vehicle in handcuffs. I pushed the tablet back to David and instructed him to ensure our internal audit trails were perfectly insulated from the fallout of my brother's highly publicized federal indictment. I stood up from my executive chair, smoothing the crisp, flawless lines of my tailored charcoal suit, preparing to transition into my next scheduled strategy meeting regarding our overseas accounts. The quiet professional hum of the boardroom was suddenly interrupted by a soft electronic chime echoing from the communications console embedded in the table. I reached out and pressed the glowing silver button connecting directly to the high-security reception desk, located 60 floors below, in the primary lobby of our corporate skyscraper. My executive receptionist spoke, her voice maintaining its usual crisp professionalism, but carrying a slight undertone of distinct discomfort. "Ms. Jasmine, I sincerely apologize for the unexpected interruption," she said carefully, choosing her words. "Security has just alerted me to a situation developing at the primary ground floor entrance. There is an older gentleman standing in the high-security lobby, attempting to bypass the biometric turnstiles. He does not have an appointment, and he is currently refusing to speak with the building concierges. He is loudly claiming to be your father, and he is demanding immediate access to your private executive elevator." I narrowed my eyes, staring down at the glowing intercom button as the image of my arrogant, status-obsessed father flashed through my mind. "Is he causing a physical disturbance?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely devoid of emotion. "No, Mom," the receptionist replied, her hesitation growing slightly more pronounced. "He is not being physically aggressive with the security personnel, but he is causing quite a visible scene. He appears to be deeply distressed. He is openly weeping in the center of the lobby and absolutely refusing to leave the premises until he speaks directly to his loving daughter. He keeps repeating that it is a matter of immediate family life and death." I released the intercom button and took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, sterile air of the boardroom fill my lungs. The man who had gladly mortgaged my identity and banished me from my own property was now standing at the bottom of my skyscraper, shedding pathetic tears in front of strangers. I turned to David and told him to pause my afternoon schedule. It was time to go downstairs and face the crumbling patriarch. The heavy doors of the executive boardroom closed behind me, sealing away the high-stakes corporate victory I had just secured. I walked purposefully toward the private glass elevator at the end of the corridor, my tailored charcoal suit moving perfectly in sync with my measured, confident steps. David remained upstairs managing the transition team while I mentally prepared myself to confront the ghost of my toxic past. The high-speed elevator descended 60 floors in complete silence, dropping me rapidly from the absolute pinnacle of Wall Street dominance down to the sprawling public lobby of my corporate headquarters. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft mechanical chime revealing the massive architectural expanse of the ground floor. The lobby was an intimidating cathedral of modern wealth, featuring towering marble pillars, cascading water walls, and sleek minimalist seating areas designed to make ordinary visitors feel incredibly small. I stepped out of the elevator and my eyes immediately scanned the vast open space, easily finding the source of the disturbance near the primary security checkpoint. Standing awkwardly between two heavily armed corporate guards was a man I barely recognized. Calvin, my formerly arrogant and impeccably groomed father, looked absolutely pathetic. The tailored custom suits and expensive golf club attire he used to wear like a suit of armor were completely gone. He was wearing a wrinkled, faded polo shirt and a pair of cheap slacks that looked like they had been slept in for several consecutive days. His shoulders were heavily hunched forward, and his hands were trembling as he clutched a crumpled paper coffee cup. The man who had spent his entire life commanding rooms and demanding absolute submission from his family was now reduced to a broken hollow shell. He looked up and saw me walking across the gleaming marble floor. His eyes widened with a desperate, frantic energy as he tried to push his way forward. "Jasmine," he called out, his voice cracking loudly and carrying across the quiet professional lobby. He tried to physically force his way past the security guards to reach me, but they immediately stepped into his path, forming a solid, impenetrable physical barrier. I raised my hand slightly, signaling the guards to let him speak, but to keep him at a safe distance. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him, maintaining absolute emotional detachment. "Jasmine, please, you have to listen to me," he begged, his voice trembling with raw, unfiltered desperation. "We have lost absolutely everything. Your mother and I are sleeping in a disgusting roadside motel off the highway because we have no money left to our names. The credit cards are all frozen, and our wealthy country club friends will not even return our phone calls. You have to write us a check today so we can hire a legal defense team. We are your family. We share the exact same blood, and you cannot just leave your own parents to rot in the gutter while you sit up here in a skyscraper making billions of dollars." I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. My absolute coldness was far more devastating than any aggressive screaming match could ever possibly be. I looked at the pathetic old man shivering in my corporate lobby, and I felt absolutely nothing at all. "You did not have a family, Calvin," I told him, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register that cut directly through his pathetic sobbing. "You had a golden calf and a bank account. You worshipped DeAndre because you thought his fake athletic glory and his fraudulent business ventures would buy you a permanent seat at the elite tables you so desperately craved. You treated me like an insignificant peasant whose only purpose was to serve as a convenient financial shield for his endless, reckless mistakes. You gladly committed federal wire fraud and mortgaged your own home to protect his fragile ego and maintain your fake suburban image. The calf is completely broke and the bank is permanently closed. Calvin stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as the profound reality of my words crushed whatever tiny sliver of hopeful delusion he had brought into my building. He reached a shaking hand toward my blazer, but the absolute zero temperature in my eyes stopped him. You chose your golden child. I continued smoothly, entirely unaffected by his visible agonizing despair. I suggest you go back to that cheap highway motel and wait for him to bail you out with his imaginary cryptocurrency wealth. I gave a subtle but definitive nod to the primary security guard standing to my left. Escort this individual out of the building, I ordered calmly. If he attempts to bypass the security perimeter or contact my reception desk ever again, you have my full authorization to have him arrested and charged with criminal trespassing. The guards immediately flanked my father, gripping him firmly by the arms and turning him forcefully toward the revolving glass doors leading out to the busy Manhattan street. Calvin did not fight them. He dragged his feet across the polished marble. His head hung low in ultimate permanent defeat as they marched him toward the exit. Just as the guards pushed him through the revolving doors, the massive television screens above the reception desk switched to a breaking national news broadcast. I stood perfectly still in the center of the lobby, watching the vibrant digital display illuminate the space with breaking news banners. The news anchor announced a massive coordinated federal raid targeting a prolific financial fraud ring operating out of Maryland. Live helicopter footage showed heavily armed FBI agents kicking down the doors of DeAndre's luxury apartment complex and carrying heavy boxes of physical evidence out into the street. A secondary camera feed displayed a fleet of commercial flatbed tow trucks aggressively repossessing his personal collection of leased exotic sports cars. The federal government was systematically ripping apart the very last remaining shreds of his fake empire for the entire world to witness in real time. I turned my back on the glowing screens, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit before walking confidently back toward my private executive elevator to resume my day. I returned to my corner office and opened my laptop to monitor the ongoing financial ripples caused by the federal raid on my brother's fake dealership. The corporate news networks were already shifting their focus from the criminal indictments to the spectacular social media fallout initiated by his furious wife. Brittany had wasted absolutely zero time executing a ruthless public relations strategy to protect her wealthy Nantucket family from the radioactive shame of DeAndre's colossal Ponzi scheme. She filed for an expedited divorce before the FBI even finished cataloging the seized exotic cars in his commercial lot. To ensure the entire world knew she was cutting all ties, she launched a live video broadcast from her parents' luxury estate. The broadcast was a masterful display of weaponized white female victimhood mixed with absolute vindictive cruelty. She stared directly into the camera, holding her pregnant belly, and systematically stripped away every single remaining ounce of my brother's manufactured dignity. She explicitly detailed how DeAndre had secretly drained her personal trust funds to pay for his cheap leased suits and his fake designer watches. She told thousands of live viewers that his entire alpha male persona was a complete biological and financial fiction. She publicly humiliated his performance as a husband, his intelligence as a businessman, and his fundamental worth as a human being. She completely obliterated his reputation, ensuring that even if he somehow avoided federal prison, he would forever remain a global laughingstock. The broadcast went viral, instantly generating millions of views and solidifying his permanent exile from high society. The swift and brutal destruction of his marriage was only a minor precursor to the catastrophic legal nightmare waiting for him at the federal courthouse. The Securities and Exchange Commission had coordinated perfectly with the Department of Justice, presenting a towering mountain of irrefutable evidence against him. Because my corporate attorneys had initiated a total freeze on every single one of his holding accounts, he was completely unable to hire a private defense team. The man who had spent the last 5 years mocking my simple clothes and bragging about his unlimited wealth was now sitting in a cold holding cell, waiting for a severely overworked public defender to take his case. The federal prosecutors were completely merciless in their approach, charging him with dozens of counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and interstate financial exploitation. The Miami lending syndicate had already cut their losses and vanished, leaving him to face the absolute maximum penalties alone. The presiding federal judge reviewed the sheer scope of his predatory financial deception and immediately denied him bail, deeming him a severe flight risk. DeAndre was officially facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He would spend the next decade wearing a standard issue orange jumpsuit, sharing a tiny concrete cell with individuals who did not care about his former football glory or his fake cryptocurrency empire. While my brother sat rotting in federal custody, my mother Vivian decided to launch her own pathetic campaign for public sympathy. Operating from the cheap roadside motel I had banished them to, she managed to set up a crowdfunding page on the internet. She titled the campaign Helpless Elderly Parents, Evicted by Cruel Corporate Daughter. She uploaded several highly edited photos of herself and Calvin, looking incredibly frail and destitute, deliberately attempting to manufacture a tragic narrative. In her lengthy, desperate description, she claimed that I had suffered a psychological breakdown and illegally stolen their beautiful Maryland estate out of pure vindictive jealousy. She begged the public to donate $100,000 so they could hire an attorney to fight my supposed elder abuse and reclaim their family legacy. She truly believed that her talent for suburban manipulation would successfully translate to the digital world. She thought she could easily scam sympathetic strangers into funding her return to luxury living without ever facing the consequences of her profound financial crimes. She severely underestimated the ruthless efficiency of modern internet investigators. Within hours of her publishing the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign, the affluent neighbors from my newly acquired cul-de-sac uploaded their personal smartphone videos to various social media platforms. The high-definition footage showed the massive black Sikorsky helicopter descending violently onto the manicured lawn. The internet watched in absolute fascination as the hurricane-force rotor wash blasted my screaming mother and my pathetic brother while I boarded my multi-million-dollar aircraft with absolute cold precision. The digital audience, the undeniable truth of the eviction, completely exposing the reality that my parents were not helpless victims, but rather arrogant fraudsters who had simply lost a high-stakes financial battle against a much stronger opponent. The raw, unedited video completely shattered my mother's fabricated victim narrative. Thousands of internet users flooded her crowdfunding page with relentless mocking comments, completely destroying her fragile ego. People ruthlessly ridiculed her ruined silk dress, her flying garbage bags, and her dramatic feint onto the concrete driveway. They mocked Calvin's desperate scrambling and DeAndre's pathetic crawling through the deep mud. The internet showed her absolutely zero mercy, turning her entire tragic appeal into a massive global joke. The crowdfunding platform quickly flagged her campaign for fraudulent activity based on the overwhelming user reports, and they permanently deleted her account, confiscating the few meager donations she had managed to trick out of people. I sat in my immaculate office, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair, and watched the final evening news segment covering the viral embarrassment of the people who had tormented me for 3 decades. The newscasters were laughing openly at the footage of my family fleeing the helicopter downwash, treating their ultimate downfall as a light-hearted entertainment piece at the end of their broadcast. The visual confirmation of their complete and total ruin provided a profound sense of absolute closure. My toxic past had been successfully neutralized and permanently discarded. I gently closed the silver lid of my laptop, shutting off the digital noise completely. The final tether to my former life was officially severed, allowing me to look forward to the vast, unobstructed future I had built for myself. I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp, filtered air circulating through my corporate suite, feeling an incredible wave of absolute tranquility settle permanently deep within my chest, knowing I had finally achieved perfect justice. Exactly 3 months passed before I allowed myself to return to the sprawling brick estate in Prince George's County. The biting winter chill had completely melted away, giving rise to a warm, vibrant Maryland spring. I did not arrive in a heavily armed tactical helicopter this time, nor did I take a basic rideshare vehicle. I drove myself in a sleek, quiet electric sedan, enjoying the absolute peace of the morning commute, As the heavy wrought iron gates swung open, the visual transformation of the property was immediately striking. My father's obsessive country club aesthetic had been entirely stripped away. The ostentatious luxury vehicles that once cluttered the massive circular driveway were permanently gone, replaced by sensible, modest cars belonging to my new staff. The exterior of the mansion no longer projected an aura of arrogant, exclusionary wealth. Instead, a tasteful brushed steel plaque mounted near the front entrance proudly displayed the new purpose of the property: the Obsidian Foundation for Economic Empowerment. I had absolutely no intention of selling the house after legally evicting my toxic relatives. Selling it would have been a quick financial transaction, but repurposing it was a profound generational victory. I walked up the brick steps and pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of heavy perfumes and manufactured suburban superiority had vanished completely. The grand foyer was now bright and welcoming, filled with the energetic hum of productive collaborative work. I walked straight down the long corridor toward the formal dining room, where my family had attempted to ambush me with that fraudulent trust fund contract. The heavy, oppressive mahogany dining table had been physically chopped up and thrown into a dumpster weeks ago. The room was now transformed into a state-of-the-art financial literacy classroom. Rows of sleek modular desks filled the space, facing a massive interactive digital whiteboard. 24 young, disenfranchised African American women sat at those desks, actively engaging in a high-level seminar on venture capital acquisition and predatory debt avoidance. These were women who had been marginalized, abused, or financially exploited by their own families and partners. They were learning exactly how to build impenetrable financial armor. A young woman named Maya raised her hand, asking a complex question about leveraging corporate debt structures to protect personal assets. I leaned against the doorframe, listening as my lead financial instructor effortlessly broke down the complicated Wall Street mechanics into digestible, actionable strategies. Maya furiously took notes, her eyes burning with the exact same fierce, relentless determination I had relied upon when I first escaped my family's toxic grip. She was not learning how to buy flashy designer clothes or lease expensive sports cars to impress superficial neighbors. She was learning how to fundamentally control her own time and her own destiny. My foundation was actively providing them with the exact financial education and legal resources my parents had intentionally withheld from me. We were systematically breaking the generational curses of financial illiteracy and familial exploitation. I gave the instructor a subtle nod of approval before turning away from the classroom, letting them focus entirely on their vital education. I continued my walk through the renovated ground floor, making my way toward the back of the estate where my father used to maintain his private study. The room that Calvin once used to hide his mounting criminal debts and forged banking documents was now my personal executive office. When I visited the foundation, I sat behind a modern glass desk, booting up my computer to check the morning market reports. My legal team had sent a brief mandatory update regarding the federal prosecutions. DeAndre had officially been transferred to a high-security federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania, beginning his decade-long sentence for orchestrating his massive Ponzi scheme. Calvin and Vivian had formally pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of accessory to wire fraud, completely avoiding jail time, but receiving 5 years of strict federal probation and a crushing mountain of financial restitution. They were currently living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood, working minimum-wage retail jobs just to survive, paying off their massive government fines, working long, exhaustive shifts under managers half their age. Every single dollar they managed to scrape together was immediately garnished by the federal courts to satisfy their astronomical debt obligations. I read the brief legal update with total emotional detachment before permanently archiving the email into a secure encrypted folder. Their daily misery was simply the natural mathematical consequence of their own profound greed. I closed the laptop and stepped out through the French doors leading to the expansive front lawn. The morning sun felt incredibly warm against my skin as I walked across the property. I stopped walking when I reached the exact geometric center of the yard. This was the precise location where the massive matte black Sikorsky helicopter had touched down and aggressively crushed the earth beneath its landing gear. The violent hurricane-force winds generated by the twin turboshaft engines had obliterated my father's prized, decades-old rose bushes and churned the immaculate turf into a terrifying, chaotic mud pit. Looking down at my feet, I smiled. The deep mechanical ruts and the ruined soil were completely gone. The landscaping team had not just repaired the damage they had cultivated, something entirely new and incredibly resilient. Vibrant, healthy green grass had grown back thicker and stronger than before, completely erasing the physical scars of the brutal eviction the earth had fully recovered, absorbing the violent disruption and using it to fuel fresh, uncontaminated growth. I stood alone in the quiet Maryland morning, breathing in the crisp, clean air. I had successfully neutralized every single threat against my empire and permanently secured my absolute freedom. My toxic relatives had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was a pathetic, insignificant loser who would never amount to anything without their arrogant, conditional approval. They had demanded my ultimate financial submission to cover their fraudulent tracks, expecting me to eagerly sacrifice my entire future to preserve their fragile, wealthy image. They had ruthlessly mocked my basic clothing choices and gleefully laughed at my reliance on public transportation while secretly drowning in their own catastrophic criminal debt. They genuinely believed that my entire existence was defined by the superficial materialistic items I chose not to consume. They thought my worth was tied to their validation and the car I could not afford. They did not realize that a woman who builds her own wings does not need to drive, she flies.